Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Kris. This was not requested. It popped up on my feed because every now and then I get shorts. This is the Austin School, and is it Dr. Roy? Yes, Dr. Roy. That guy. Dr. Roy C in a hay house. He popped up on my short talking about the Aztecs. That's what it was. And I thought, I'll check that out. I liked him. I did one on, I'm going to butcher the name, I'm sure, Khalid, Walid. A lot of people didn't know about him. I had to kind of tell everyone about him. So I put that word out. Deserve a little bit of credit for that. And I liked his, I think I did something else too. But I liked kind of just how he spoke. I enjoyed it. So this is Dr. Roy gives a brief, overview of, I got to yawn now. A burp and then a yawn. Dr. Roy gives a brief overview of the U.S. presidency. This is 2 hours and 9 minutes. So we'll do this in one video. No, we won't. It's going to be 6 videos, about 21 and a half minutes. But that thumbs up, and if you can subscribe as well, that benefits me tremendously, more than you'll ever know. It's like you giving me a handshake and slipping me a lot of money. I don't know how that translates, but it just lets YouTube know that I'm not worthless. So they help promote it. And then you can donate to the channel through the thanks button. If you do, you request a video, your name's sponsoring that video. You can still request without donating. Just takes a little bit more time. I got nothing else to say. I got my Snapple peach tea, which, why would you be able to read it? You know what I mean? There you go. Peach tea. So let's get into Dr. Roy. So
let's just get this thing going. So the topic tonight was picked sort of quickly and randomly, where I just listed a bunch of topics, and my wife goes, well, it's an election year for the presidency. Why don't you talk about the presidency? And I went, oh, that is genius. Let's talk about the presidency. So then at that point, it no longer felt random. It felt like we had deliberately sat down and conjured up a really good topic. To do this, though, and some of you have figured this out about me by now, I want to start in the beginning. So the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. I'm kidding, that's too far back. Although, is it? So I'm going to do a couple of things tonight, hopefully, depending on how time rolls out. But before we go anywhere, because there's going to be a political scientist who's going to see this uploaded to YouTube later, and they're going to want to know something about me. So yes, I am madly in love with the work of Steven Skowronek. I'm going to out myself as a Skowronekian, and that, I don't know if that's a thing yet, but it needs to become one. Having said that, that doesn't mean I don't have other sources. Like, it doesn't mean I'm not going to invoke Richard Neustadt or something. It doesn't mean that I'm only going to one person. It's just, I think Steven Skowronek may be a political science god. Like, he's in the pantheon for sure. I'll give you a hint why. When he wrote his book, which, if I remember correctly, was in '89, he described Bill Clinton, who will be the next president in 3 years, right? But he's not there yet. Well, he'll get elected in 3 years. He'll be the next president in 4 years. And then said, that guy will get impeached. And it's like, all right, you won me over. Like, I don't even care what you say after that. You predicted Bill Clinton's impeachment, which was so bizarre and irrational. I feel like anybody who could have nailed something so random and ridiculous deserves some form of credit. All right, so having gotten that out of the way, what I want to do is I want to nest the presidency historically with other forms of government. That's where I want to start. And then we're going to go. And if time allows, and I do this correctly, I'm going to show you how the presidency has been evolving into the institution it has become now. Because this is not the presidency that James Madison had anticipated. It's just so we're clear. It shouldn't be too big of a surprise, especially considering that the document was written, 240 years ago. You would think you'd want like an update or something at some point. maybe, I'm just throwing that out there, maybe a society that had barely started doing steam power isn't equipped to write a constitution for a society that's just unleashed AI and has doomed humanity to extinction. So I know it's not going to be that horrible. I love sci-fi, and every sci-fi tells me we're going to die, except Star Wars. But Star Wars isn't really sci-fi, because there's no story, you know what I mean? It's just like a series of really beautiful scenes strung together. So it's kind of like, I don't know, sci-fi modeling. Cool costumes, silly robots, and it's a little dark sometimes. Rogue One is definitely the best sci-fi movie, and then after that, Solo, and then the other 9 are, which is sad. I mean, 3 are awful, but 6 are, All right, so, I think the average American, if asked, where did we get the idea for the type of government we have, would say, well, we made it up.
We stole a lot of it from the concepts from. I'm recording here. We stole a lot of concepts from the British, and then everything that we did, we kind of took ideas from. That's kind of my understanding, and I'm probably wrong. Very well could be.
Right? The story might go like this. I've said this story before, but I feel like it's a good one. James Madison climbs into the Appalachian Mountains. He confronts a burning bush. The burning bush begins to speak to him, and after a brief conversation, hands him 2 stone tablets. Madison decides to walk to Philadelphia, and on his way he stumbles, drops the stone tablets. They shatter on the ground, at which point he picks up the pieces and asks the guys in Philadelphia to do a stone tablet gluing convention, and that's what the Constitutional Convention was. It was right? I'm pretty sure some of you believe that, he was probably tripped by a dinosaur, since they coexisted with humans and the Earth is only 5,000 years old. The other story you might have is that there was a room filled with super brilliant geniuses who created a brand new form of government out of the ether, and that was because they were geniuses. And also, you probably were taught that we invented the car, we invented glasses. You were probably also taught that we invented rockets, and the Wright brothers were the first to fly, and it turns out literally all of those things are wrong. It's so sad. Here's what happened. Here's what actually happened. We had a government under the English, and then later the British, that looked shockingly like the government we ended up with. But at the time of the Revolution, it didn't. In other words, the English had a government like the government we have now. They got rid of it, and then we did the revolution and went, no, we're going to do that other one, not the one you currently have. If you were to jump into a time machine and go back to, let's just do 800 years, just to make it simple, to England, you would have realized that their government had 3 branches. Isn't that weird? There was the king, and then the king included a cabinet or a group of advisors. It becomes more formalized later, but at the time it was a group of advisors. And then the nobles, so barons and dukes and earls, right? And then there was the church. So the church was totally a political entity. It played a game of politics. The church's power came from two sources. One was its moral authority. The other thing that the church had was a quarter of the land. 1 out of every 4 acres in Western and Central Europe belonged to the Catholic Church. Think about it. That literally means that 1/4 of Western and Central Europe's GDP belonged to the Catholic Church. That's a lot of money to do a lot of influence. Now, the Catholic Church had high overhead because they had to build these gigantic cathedrals that took 400 years to build. You know, that's expensive. So I'm not saying they didn't have like a really big cost threshold they had to work through. But it also meant that they had the resources to basically self-reproduce themselves by having a massive clergy, right? They were the moral authority. The king was sometimes the executive authority, sometimes the legislative authority. And then the nobles were in this really weird role. Because one of the reasons I picked 800 years ago is it's post-Magna Carta. With the Magna Carta, Parliament is created. At that point, the nobles are now formally in a legislative position. They literally have legislative power because Parliament exists as an entity to organize the nobles. In other words, the king is the president, Congress is the nobility and Parliament, and the Supreme Court is the church. See how cool that is? The English actually messed this up. When Henry VIII goes Protestant so he can get rid of his wife, because he wanted an annulment, not a divorce. He gets a divorce, but that's later. That's Anne of Cleves. He wants an annulment for Catherine of Aragon. When he does this, he actually completely flips English politics upside down, because the way Henry VIII does this is by becoming the head of the Church of England. In other words, he took the Church of England, which was a Catholic entity, he got rid of the Pope, changed nothing else. So he basically created like Diet Catholicism. It was Pope-free Catholicism, where he's in charge, which really is amazing because it means, in a way, that England became a little theocratic because its king is the head of the church. But it also now means he owns a quarter of England, which now means there's no third party he has to interact with when he interacts with the nobles. Because the church understood something really early on in European politics. If the king started to get too powerful, go work with the nobles to push back against the king. If the nobles got too powerful, go run over and support the king to push back against the nobles. And that way, nobody was totally in charge. That was the balancing act that the church had figured out to do. Henry goes Protestant, jettisons the church, suddenly owns a quarter of England. He's now in a position to just dictate to Parliament. Because see, here's how this worked. If you're the king in medieval England before it goes Protestant, you go to the nobles and you say, I want to do X, whatever it is, build a ship, build a palace, go to war. Well, the nobles had the ability to go, we're not going to fund it. Some nobles might want to fund it because they want the king's favor. Other nobles would say no. Once they had Parliament, they could even vote on it. The majority of us said no, not going to do it. In other words, the king didn't have absolute authority like all Hollywood movies portray the king as having. The king actually was a shockingly weak person. There were dukes that were more powerful than kings, because if a duke had enough land and enough resources, that duke could challenge the king's authority. They just didn't have the title of king. So we had a system where there was sort of like a built-in divided powers, like we ended up with. Henry VIII comes along, goes Protestant, has all this money. He goes to the nobles and says, I want a palace, fund it. If they say no, he goes, don't worry about it, I got it. He goes and sells some land. Now he builds his palace with his own coin. In other words, the nobles now have a problem, because if he has a policy, like let's say he wants to go to war, and they say we don't want to fund it, and he funds it himself, well then they have no say in what happens. The only way they'll have say in what happens is if they fund it themselves, or at least partially fund it, because then they can say, this money comes with some stipulations. But then the king realizes, you know what, I'm so powerful I can just kill off opponents in Parliament. And he begins to do that. And before you know it, he is in absolute charge. Henry VIII is the first absolute ruler of England. Just as he's dying, he wonders, man, I wonder if I made a mistake. Goes, you know what? I'm going to ask the Pope for forgiveness and switch back to being Catholic. He didn't want to take a chance. His son, Edward VI, nobody remembers his name. Nobody even remembers he had a son. Is sick. He doesn't do much. I think he was king for 9 years. He dies young. Done. He's out of the way. He's replaced by Mary. She's only queen for 5 years. Bloody Mary, right? She's also Catholic. She gets replaced by Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I is hands down the greatest monarch in England's history. That's why she's not Elizabeth the Great. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, she's a woman. That's why she's not Elizabeth the Great. Forgot. The Russians have Catherine the Great, but the English will never make a woman the Great because they're too sexist. That's sad when the Russians are ahead of you. You know what I mean? That's. Don't get me wrong. The Russians are ahead in so many ways. Like, for example, did you know women have female last names in Russia? Isn't that cool? It's not quite as cool as with the Swedes, right? Like, nobody's running around going that they're Jon's son. They would be Jon's daughter, because that doesn't make sense. See how weird that is? Anyway, so Elizabeth I is a fantastic monarch. She lays the foundation for England to actually become something. If it wasn't for Elizabeth I, England would have never built the empire it eventually built. She's replaced by James I. He's replaced by Charles I. Charles I is a mess. He's such a catastrophic mess. I'm surprised the English didn't retire the name Charles. He's such a mess. He triggers a civil war. He's defeated in the Civil War because Parliament brings out an army and defeats him. They arrest him, try him, convict him, cut off his head. Charles I is the only English monarch ever executed. There were English monarchs that died in the battlefield, like Richard III, but he dies by decapitation. It's brutal. That then ends up in a situation where Parliament is just in charge. And in that situation, England became a republic, because that's the definition of a republic. They call themselves a commonwealth, but they were a republic. And then Oliver Cromwell dissolves Parliament twice, and then becomes a tyrant. And then he dies of old age, as people tend to do sometimes. And then the English basically talk his son into abdicating, which he does. And then Parliament's back in charge again. England's a republic again. And the English think, oh, okay, we killed Charles I, made his son, Charles II, leave the throne as a child. We then ended up with Parliament in charge. That was great. But then we ended up with a tyranny with Oliver Cromwell. That wasn't great. And then we talked his son out of this, which was good. But we're back to where we were before the tyranny. How do we prevent us from having another tyranny down the road? And here's what the English conclude. Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan, he says, you need a monarchy. He basically says human beings are, by their nature, monarchists. Human beings want somebody they can focus all their loyalty and admiration into. And if you don't give them that person, they will go get them. Hence Oliver Cromwell. So, what Thomas Hobbes says is...
You probably say that with hatred as well. They want to focus love and adulation. And then, who do you blame when things are bad? That attention goes to one person. It does swing both ways.
If you want to stop tyranny, introduce a little tyranny. What's a vaccine? He didn't have that concept, but we do now, so I'm going to invoke it. A vaccine is oftentimes the virus you're trying to protect against. That was his thinking. Give them the monarch they want. You will know who the person is, so you can prepare for it. When they're a child, you can start preparing, because you'll already know what their personality is like. They'll have been trained for the job their whole life, so you know you're not getting some random unskilled nitwit. He might be a nitwit, but at least he's got some training. And then, right, you've got some...
He's got nitwit training.
Stability and some calm. And then if anybody tries to become a tyrant, people will rally around the king. Done. The tyrant will be defeated. So the English go to Charles II and they go, hey, we hear you're unemployed. And he's like, yeah, because you got rid of my throne. And they go, well, we hope you're not too bitter about that. You want to come back and be king again? And he goes, sure. And they go, wait. We want you to be limited in your power. We want Parliament to stay in charge, but you'll have a lot of authority. We're not making you a figurehead, but you're not in charge. It's going to be us. And he's like, sure. Turned out Charles II was, you know, a little, how shall we say, mentally unstable. That's the word. His mom decided to raise him as Catholic, so he's Catholic, which is awkward, right? The English are trying to kill all the Catholics, and now they have a Catholic king. It's so weird. It would have been like if the United States had elected a Muslim in like 2008 or something. Anyway, so awkward. Oh yeah, we just slaughtered a bunch of Muslims. Not that all Muslims are bad. I mean, your dad must have been a nice guy and all. I have to throw the stat out there just because it's so shocking. So the latest report on refugees is we're at 120 million now on the planet, the highest ever. So we've exceeded the post-World War II numbers. And that's after we ethnically cleansed whole parts of Eastern Europe, mostly of Germans, but there were other ethnicities that got a little zapped too in the process, in part because the Germans were doing it too. And then they got it done to them. Because right, two wrongs makes a right? I'm pretty sure that's right. I know that two Roys, I recently had an experience where I was with another Roy, definitely makes a right. So that's for sure. Roys get excited when we meet Roys. We get, oh my God, there's another one. It's so weird. 120 million, half of them are Arab. Arabs are 6% of the world's population. So, well done. That's what you call representing. It's brutal. All right, so I derailed myself with that. So Charles is a little crazy. Poor guy. He's a little unhinged. He's Catholic. He's the Catholic ruler of a Protestant country hell-bent on killing as many Catholics as possible. So those cabinet meetings are always a little awkward. He's married to a Portuguese wife. His queen is Portuguese. I shouldn't have to say this. She was crazy too. And the reason I shouldn't have to say it is I just said she was Portuguese. You know what I mean? But I know some of you don't know that about the Portuguese. So I'm going to get a lot of hate on that one. But it's because I love the Portuguese, especially because they don't know how to pronounce letters. It's wrong. So they spend most of their time completely naked in the palace, running in circles, in the palace that Henry VIII built. They're just zoom, 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 right? And everybody's watching him going, what the heck? And then he dies. Charles II, fortunately, doesn't live too long. He's not king for very long. His brother, James II, takes over. James II is also Catholic, but he did right by the English and had only daughters. So the thinking is, we'll wait until he dies and then we'll find a nice, young, strapping Protestant lad and we'll marry him off to one of James's daughters, instant Protestant king. Just add water, really, at that point. And yeah, James II messes this up and has a son in 1687. So they realize, 3 Catholic kings in a row, this is not acceptable. We can't allow this. So it takes them a couple of years to figure it out, but they do the Glorious Revolution in 1689. It was neither glorious nor a revolution. It was a coup d'etat. It was a shameless coup d'etat to punish the guy for having a son. But it's also really horrible for the English because they were at war with the Dutch, and the guy that they get to replace James II is William of Orange, the King of the Netherlands. So in a way, the English lose their war against the Dutch because suddenly the King of the Netherlands is the King of England. Like I think that's what defeat looks like.
All right. He has not gotten into anything president related, but he really is going back in history to explain. So, but it's 21 and a half minutes or so. We're going to go ahead and stop it there. That's part one. This is going to be a 6-parter. So, I think it's a 6-parter. Yeah. Yes. All right. Sorry he didn't get into the presidency yet, minus mentioning James Madison, who is very, very, very underrated in terms of what he did to help establish the government, pre-government, well, government. I've mentioned it before. James Madison is one of those people that I been to his house, beautiful home, been to his grave, respect him, appreciate him, but I'm a Washington fan. And he turned on Washington after having such a great relationship with him because Thomas Jefferson got into his head. And I've said this before, and I think in some of the other videos, by about 1789, Washington became president, probably 1791. Washington was really leaning on Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson didn't like him, butted heads with him. Jefferson wanted a small government, states powerful, federal government weak. Hamilton wanted a strong federal government and weaker states, pretty much kind of what we have. Washington sided more with that. So Jefferson decided to start turning people against him, and he went at Madison. Jefferson did. Madison was on board with what Alexander Hamilton was saying because they were both writing the Federalist Papers. So they were agreeing. Jefferson got into his head. Madison started turning against Washington, and Washington dies. Jefferson is having Madison write articles in the newspaper, even when Washington was alive, about Washington and about John Adams when Adams got elected president, basically just bashing them. And they were writing under, false names. I can't think of it. Is it pseudonyms? No. Alias? I don't remember the word. So Madison was Jefferson's right-hand man, just his pit bull. And he just kept doing it. Jefferson becomes president. Madison's his guy, defending all his policies in the paper and doing all this stuff. Jefferson retires, third president. Madison gets elected in, fourth president. Madison is starting to see there's issues with some of the things that Jefferson's policies he enacted, like the embargo, trade embargo and stuff like that, because of the ongoing war between the British and the French. And Madison needed to make some changes. He had went to Jefferson and said he wanted to do this, and he asked Jefferson to write articles basically saying it was about time and everything. And Jefferson flat out said, "I'm retired. You'll have to find somebody else to do all that for you." Now, mind you, this is 1809, 1810, give or take. Madison had been his right-hand man, his pit bull, his doing everything for him from 1791 to 1809. And now he asks for a favor in return, and Jefferson's like, no. So Madison starts doing some things, and then he starts reading things in the paper, blasting him. And he thought, wow. But it really looked familiar. It sounded familiar. After his presidency, he went home to Montpelier and started going over his papers. And he realized that that entire time he was Jefferson's right-hand man, Jefferson turned on him and was bashing him in the papers. And Madison stewed over this. How could I have been his guy for so long and no loyalty in return? And I'm sure everyone out there can understand the story because we all know somebody like that. Somebody who will use you, but will never give you what you need in return. Just got to cut those people out. But Madison didn't know any better. So when Jefferson died in 1826 on 4th of July, everyone started asking Madison, he's the greatest president. Jefferson's the greatest president, right? And Madison straight up said no. He rebuked them all. No, Washington is the greatest president. And they were like, but you and Jefferson were tight. And he never expanded on it until after he died and he had his papers. When he had written some articles near the end of his life. I'm sorry, I jumped. Where he basically made it sound like, yeah, maybe not papers. He not to be published, but he had written things basically saying, yeah, apparently, I'm definitely summing up what he said more directly, but he was like, apparently I was used, and that hurt because he left office 1817, and the death of Jefferson was in 1826. So he stewed for another 9, 10 years, and then he himself died. I think it was March 28th, 18. I want to say 1831, but I have a feeling that was Monroe. Let me check. Pause. Okay. So James Madison, I said June 28th, 1831. It was June 28th, 1836. So the 1831, I'm going to guess, was James Monroe, who was July 4th, 1831. When did James Monroe die?
James Monroe died on July 4th, 1831.
Okay, so I got the day, March 28th, wrong year. And just so you don't think I'm lying, when did James Madison die? I almost forgot his name.
James Madison died on June 28th, 1836.
There you go. So, and then, when did Thomas Jefferson die?
Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826.
Yep. So, he had a good almost 10 years. Well, I guess it would be almost 11 if you're going to get technical. I'm not here to do math. But anyways, you can see that he had a lot of time to really stew. And after Jefferson's death, he really started looking at things. And I think he spent a lot of that time frustrated that he had allowed someone to come between him. Because when him and Washington broke ways, that really hurt Washington, like really hurt him. Because Washington leaned on Madison, writing him during the Revolutionary War. And then from 1783, when Washington resigned his commission and went back to being a farmer, which he didn't, he stayed very active in politics, to 1789, in that 6-year span, him and Madison were writing all the time because they were both trying to get the government going, and they were trying to figure out what can we do, policies, getting people together, who can we talk to. And Washington was active because he wanted things for himself. He was trying to get a company going, for like a water project, I want to say, I think for the Potomac maybe, or Ohio River. I don't even remember now off the top of my head. But he was trying to get something there. So he was trying to get some government money. But I've spoken way too much right now, so I do apologize. But anyways, I'm going to end this video here. Hopefully part 2, he'll get into the presidents, because that's where I really want to get into it. I love that. So until next time, have a good day. Have a good night.